Hey everybody, welcome to Dreamseed VR. I'm your host Seraphin, and today I'm bringing you a really cool interview with a longtime friend of mine named Jake Kobrin, who is an amazingly talented visionary artist as well as a magician and somebody who transverses the realms of traditional art, digital art, alchemy and mysticism, and he's also become a enthusiast of virtual reality in the past few years. So I wanted to sit down and talk with him about his practice as an artist, as a magician, as well as how he's been integrating virtual reality into those practices. So I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. And here we go. Let's dive in.
So cool. How's it going? This is my
Really,
first time doing this, like hanging out with somebody in VR chat.
I'm doing great. I'm excited that it's all working the way it should. So I find it really surreal that we've known each other for such a long time, but our paths sort of like diverged socially, but we ended up on such similar paths and then sort of like ended up
Yeah, totally.
in virtual reality in different ways. So I think that's super cool. There's not a whole lot of people with as much of an overlap in my field right now.
Mm,
There's definitely other visionary artists who are into VR, but I don't think there are as many who have that like triple overlap with magic and mysticism as well as the psychedelic aspect and then virtual reality. So I'm excited.
mhm.
So for those of my viewers who aren't familiar with your work currently, how would you describe what you do in a nutshell?
What I do is explore various means of accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness, which includes the use of psychedelics as well as esoteric techniques from various world traditions and things that I've just developed and experiment with myself, like ceremonial magic, lucid dreaming, and meditation, you know, you name it. And having these non-ordinary state experiences and then attempting to communicate those experiences through the medium of visual art.
Mhm.
And I'm both a digital and traditional media artist. But for me, those two things, the exploration of consciousness as well as the creation of art, have been parallel throughout my exploration of life and have pretty much been my two main focuses.
It's a unique place to be both a traditional artist and a digital artist nowadays, especially with this medium. I'm curious,
Mhm.
like what was the inception for finding yourself on this path? What was the some of the early inspirations and things that drew you into being curious about non-ordinary states of consciousness?
I think I've always been naturally um, sort of tuned into these kinds of states of consciousness, and I do believe in sort of a natural proclivity or ability with it. I remember having basically astral projection experiences when I was very young as something I could kind of just do naturally and tap into at will. And I've always had a very vivid imagination in that way, like a very strong visualization capacity,
Hmm.
just as a natural ability. So I think that lent itself well towards the exploration of inner states, sort of third eye type experiences.
Hmm.
And art is also just something that I've always done. I got most heavily into creating art when I was in high school. It was kind of like my way of disassociating from the world, and I absolutely hated being in high school. And art was like I could go into another dimension through creating art. So I just poured myself into it because externally the environment around me was so unfriendly and unwelcoming that creating art allowed me to kind of separate from that. And those two things kind of they're more similar and less distinct than I think people try to make them be. I mean, to create visual art is an exploration of the imaginal, just as exploring these different state experiences are. They're both explorations of the psyche,
Hmm.
just a slightly different technique to achieve that. So my art has always been fantastical. It's always come from within me. I've never really been too much of a realist artist, although I've learned that as a way. way of grounding in a technique. So for me, it's always been about the exploration of the mind, the psyche, and the imagination, and the spirit, but those things all being kind of one.
That's really, I don't know, sort of revelatory for me to hear you talk about that because I've watched your work over the years and I don't really know much about your early work or like, who Jake was in high school, but I really relate to the idea that art is a tool of exploring the psyche because I have a similar perspective, but I find that a lot of other
Hmm.
people don't necessarily see it like that. Um, and in a way, it kind of dovetails to what I wanted to ask you about next. I'm curious because we also have that overlap as magical practitioners. And for me,
Hmm.
I have always felt like art in and of itself is an exploration of that. And
Oh, absolutely.
sometimes it's hard to articulate. And sometimes I'll use the metaphor of early cave paintings that was a way for them to sort of illustrate their will and their intention and kind of run through the imagination as like a trial run of what they want to create
Absolutely.
in the
Yeah.
real world. Yeah. So I'm curious
I mean,
about how that sort of like folds into your practice as an artist and how you were saying, being able to tap into the ability to astral project and have such a natural connection to your spiritual body, how that evolved into sort of having like a conscious relationship with magic and art.
so my interest in magic arose around the same time that I started getting more serious about my art practice. So in a way, although I've devoted more time and energy probably into learning and practicing visual art, I've been exploring magic around the same amount of time. It was in high school that I was introduced to the work of Aleister Crowley and Anton LaVey. And I mean, those were my early kind of magical influences. Crowley still is a very heavy one for me, LaVey not so much. But um, yeah, I think certainly the early cave paintings would reflect what would be called in magical terminology a hypersigil. And that's what I actually believe was the orientation that these early cave painters had.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that they were it's acknowledged that these caves were temples and that they were sacred places that were reached through very arduous means and consecrated as very special and holy places. So it wasn't random that people would go to these places, probably to do ceremony and ritual, which at the time was proto-religious and certainly magical. And I think that the act of creating these paintings, I think that they fully believed in its magical properties, that by painting these scenes, that they would have a greater ability to be able to execute their will, which was in the hunting of these animals. So I think that the earliest impulses of art in human history are a magical one. And I have a friend who he works with the band Behemoth, and he creates a lot of like satanic art, and he creates a lot of art for grimoires and things like that. So his art is magical, but it's a bit on the darker side. But we were talking about it, and I was like, "Well, do you practice magic?" And he said he doesn't, but he's like, in all the grimoires they talk about like drawing a circle, and he says, "I draw a circle." And it's like, yeah, well, there you go. If you draw a spirit or an entity, you are summoning that spirit or entity into existence. And there are a lot of strange parallels actually to look at the lives of artists and see how their lives are reflected in the types of works of art that they create. For example, some artists who focus on tragedy tend to have sort of tragic lives in a certain sense. Like you got to be careful what you're summoning in, because it is a process of invocation to be creating
Mm-hmm.
works of art. So like Beksinski, for example, he's one of my favorite artists and his work is amazing, but he lived a rather tragic life. and he died very tragically. He was murdered in a strange burglary.
Hmm.
So there could be something to that. There could be something to him summoning in these circumstances through concentrating such an intense amount of psychic energy onto these tragic images. And likewise, I think that generally people who paint a lot of light, they tend to be really, you tend to see that reflected in their lives as people as well. So I do think that, to create art is a trance. It is an interface with your subconscious. You are infusing your consciousness with the imagery that you're creating, and so it should be done consciously, and you have to be careful in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting how there are so many artists now who sort of dabble in really powerful symbolism. And even though they might not recognize it on a conscious level, they're still interacting with it. Like whether or not, they're sort of like a paintbrush for hire for musicians and things like that. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
in
definitely.
in a way, all art is a form of magic. I was really stoked you brought up hypersigils. Um, the first example of a hypersigil I came across was Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, and he's a
Yeah.
really big influence on my understanding of narrative as an art form. And his life was very much taken for a wild ride when he started writing that with, whether it was conscious or not, with the understanding that it was a hypersigil. And he ended up having a lot of experiences that were what he wrote happened to King Mob in his story. And so he
Hmm.
found out real quick he had to be careful because he wrote this horrendous series of events that happened to King Mob, and shortly after that, he experienced it himself. And
Yeah,
so,
and nothing really bad happened to King Mob after that.
right, it was like the whole story took a different trajectory, and he had a much different kind of perspective on how to combat dark forces in the universe, in the metaverse as well. Yeah, so I'm curious how your understanding of art has sort of not shifted but grown into the digital arts, and then recently the medium of virtual reality. I saw that you had put together some ritual work in virtual reality, and I was really interested in how that inspiration came about and how you think that the field sort of like expands with that use of dimensionality.
Hmm. Well, I've made digital art for my entire art career. I think I got my first tablet when I was maybe 12 years old or something. So
Oh,
I
that's awesome.
basically have been making digital art for as long, if not longer, than I've been pursuing traditional media painting. In a way, I've been doing traditional media painting for less time than I've been doing digital art for. And my first encounter with VR was at Boom Festival in 2014, where I got really high on LSD. Or no, it was 2016. 16. I got really high on LSD, and Android Jones strapped me into his VR setup that he had in the back room behind the gallery, and put me into microdose, and it totally blew my mind. And it was just like a absolutely mind-blowing experience. All of the different factors. It was the last night of Boom Festival, the acid, the all of it just kind of crescendoed into, for a while, what became a feeling of kind of vocation or calling, that this is what I need to be doing, because the experience was so potent. It kind of made 2D art creation seem really kind of boring in comparison, or just way less stimulating. So I got really into VR for a minute. I bought a Vive and was attempting to learn the software like Unreal Engine that I could use to create experiences with it. I don't know what it was, but I think that I began traveling after that, but something just lent itself to me kind of like losing interest in it a little bit for a period of time. And I got into tattooing after that, which is kind of a total 180.
Oh, that's
And
exciting. I didn't know you were dabbling in that. Cool. I'll ask you about that in a little bit.
sure, yeah, I was tattooing kind of like full time for a little while, but yeah, so I got back into VR recently when the Oculus Quest 2 was released because it was inexpensive and accessible. And yeah, I mean, doing magic in VR was kind of one of my initial inspirations for buying it. I think that it is highly saturative of our consciousness, and that's something that can be used both for good and for bad, and that we do need to be conscious and mindful of what we're consuming in VR because it does totally influence our consciousness. But that can be utilized consciously, and I've, in my own personal experiments, used it consciously for some ritual work or sigil work because it's basically a brainwashing device, and I think that magic is a form of self-brainwash, really, because you're trying to engineer and program your consciousness towards reaching particular aims. And it's a great way to directly interface with your subconscious. So yeah, I've had some fun exploring, you know, different techniques. Uh, yeah, I mean, even like yeah, explored it with my partner in a particular way that isn't as PC, but I think is an effective magical technique that could be
Dude, this is not a PC.
utilized.
This is not a PC space, just so you know, like you can be as wild as you want. That's the point.
All right, cool. Well,
But
like, I mean, basically the way that like a sigil works, right, is that like you basically transfer your desire into the sigil
mhm,
and experience satisfaction of the desire having been realized through the
mhm,
process of reaching an ecstatic state of consciousness. Yeah, I mean, I think that like sex as a technique of charging sigils works, or just for magic in general works effectively because it also produces the experience of satisfaction. Right. So you can basically trick your mind into experiencing the satisfaction of your desire having realized symbolically through that
mhm,
ritual, but in a really kind of felt, tangible sense. But with VR, you can fully immerse yourself within whatever the object of your will is.
mhm,
So even like I've created using video editing software, these kinds of visual sigils where
mhm,
you can use these programs in VR that put up basically a movie screen where your visual field is entirely immersed within that. And
mhm,
this combined with ritual, or the sex magic techniques or whatever it is a really, really potent way of charging your consciousness and focusing your will on a particular desire. So it's something I've been exploring personally. I don't think it's necessarily dangerous because I'm always a bit cautious as to just making sure that my will or my desire is aligned, right? Because I think that's one of the biggest risks with magic actually, is like getting what you want, but then it actually not being for your highest or the highest of the world. So I try to be cautious just of that, at least. It's certainly psychically heavy,
mhm,
and I've definitely come out of these types of experiences realizing that it is something psychically heavy, and you shouldn't do it all the time. But
mhm,
I think that as a magical technique, it is very effective. Something I would certainly like to explore more of. I don't think that it necessarily replaces internal visualization. Like I created this video of the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram. It's one of the kind of core established rituals from the Golden Dawn. So, almost 150 to 200 years of this ritual being practiced. But a lot of people find it hard to wrap their heads around. But by demonstrating it in VR, it gives a really good analogy for what you're supposed to experience in your head while you're doing it. And that would hopefully aid people, sort of like training wheels, to be able to then be able to do the ritual effectively without using VR as a tool necessarily.
Yeah. It was funny when I saw that you had produced that. It was like a cute 100 Monkeys moment because I had been thinking quite a bit about utilizing VR to that end within the same maybe like month span when I saw you had done that. And I was super excited because for me, learning is a very visual process. And though I can pick something up, a written explanation is just so much more efficient and direct when I can see it done. And I had spent several weeks doing research on it and trying to figure out like how to do it properly because I was very late to that party. I was kind of being a wild witch doing my own thing, but I wanted to understand it. And when I saw you had put that piece together, it felt like such a awesome application to be able to give people a way to visualize it. Because I mean, beyond just watching a video of somebody doing the motions, I think being able to see the energy that you're drawing in
Yeah.
and to really be able to see it as like a living diagram of that energy makes a big difference. And I mean,
I
it's
mean,
just
what's going on
beautiful
in your
too.
head?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what's going on in your head is a lot more important than whatever physical action somebody's made. You can do all these rituals completely in your own mind, and they're, in my experience, about just as effective as actually doing the actions physically or using tools, or it's all just kind of extra stuff. Really, what's important, and even if you study magic at the adept level, you do everything within your astral temple to the point of which you don't need to do ritual. You can be riding the bus and do a full-on magic ritual of
Mm-hmm.
some kind, and there's accounts of people like Crowley doing this kind of stuff. So I do think that it is more important, the visual aspect of what goes on within your own imagination, within your own visual internal visual third eye capacities, and VR is certainly a really excellent tool to be able to instruct neophytes, to use a esoteric term, on how to properly visualize these kinds of things.
I'm curious what kinds of artifacts and things that you've been exploring in virtual reality and how you feel about the bridge between, because ultimately VR is cool, but there's an emphasis on being able to bring the things that we create into like a real world relationship with them, whether it's
Mhm.
building community or building artifacts or creating like prototype realities for people, like VR being sort of a set of training wheels, and then bringing those direct experiences sort of integrated into their psyche out into the real world. So I'm curious what kinds of objects and artifacts or worlds or just experiential pieces you've been exploring in the medium.
As for things I've been creating myself, I've been exploring gravity sketch and kind of doing these sculptural composite things, a lot of like kit bashing and stuff, but it's been really fun for me, and it's a really great way to just kind of get into a creative flow state. Like, I have very little experience with 3D modeling, but taking up gravity sketch, it's something I can kind of do without much prior training. And that's really fun for me because I want to be able to engage in a flow state as quickly as possible. And the
Mm-hmm.
barrier to entry with 3D modeling, of having to learn all these complex softwares, has kind of discouraged me a lot. Yeah, so I've been doing that for my own creativity, as well as exploring with Tilt Brush, which has limited capacities, and unfortunately, but is fun. And I've been mostly otherwise using VR for, I use it for watching online classes. It's great because it cuts out any distractions. And I've been using it for the self brainwashing slash chaos magic sort of stuff that I've been talking about previously. And I also really enjoy this app called Trip. Is really cool. They have
Mm.
guided meditations, and there's a database there of different things where you can actually sit in meditation with Ram Dass or with Jack Cornfield, and it's like they're there, and that's really cool. But there's also one yeah, there's a experience on the Trip app called, I think, Visitations, that is really, really potent. It's like a super psychedelic sound visual guided meditation thing that really does the trick for putting you into a sort of altered state of consciousness. So that's been fun to explore, and that's an app that I find I use pretty regularly.
I still have to try Trip.
And
I
then
downloaded it the other
of
week.
course, oh, you should. It's really cool. It's really beautiful what they've done, and it's pretty effective, especially I think for somebody that doesn't have much meditation experience.
Hmm.
I was one of the early beta testers for microdose back when I had the Vive
Yeah.
still,
Hmm.
and that's awesome. Yeah, I mean that's kind of it. I'm a little bit in neophyte stages when it comes to exploring VR, but I think we all are because the technology is so new. I
Oh,
kind
we
of
all
wish,
are. Oh,
and
yeah.
something that was, yeah, I mean definitely something that for me was and still is a little bit frustrating with VR is you can create something in Tilt Brush, for example, but there's not much you can do with it after that. And or at least I haven't quite figured out the workflow. Using Gravity Sketch, exporting stuff, rendering it in Blender has been a cool way for me to be able to actually utilize VR, but I'd like to see it be more, I don't know, fully internalized where you can realize and create amazing works of art fully in VR without needing to recourse to any desktop computer software. And I don't think we're there yet. I think Tilt Brush is like the MS Paint
Hmm.
of VR art software, and Photoshop hasn't been invented yet
Hmm.
or something like that. And so I'm excited to see where the technology goes in the future. I think there's huge potential for creative software and to be able to fully immerse yourself in a world of your own creation and have all these amazing tools at your disposal to create absolutely awesome stuff. But I think the software is not quite there yet.
Hmm.
But maybe, a few years down the road it will be.
Yeah, that's a really apt metaphor about Tilt Brush. And it's funny because a lot of times I'll find a lot of creativity in limitations. And so, in a way,
Hmm.
Tilt Brush has been simultaneously really frustrating, but also really exciting because it kind of forces me to find solutions for things. And it has its uses, but it definitely, especially now that it's not going to be further developed and Poly is going to be shutting down, there's only so much you can do with it.
Hmm.
But yeah, to have a fully all in one pipeline for sculpting and animating, rigging, and implementation will be really cool. Um, it's kind of a race to that. But I'm curious, we had sort of touched on earlier a little bit about how even though there's like so much promise and potential in the medium, that there's also a lot of potential for misuse or for it to be sort of like
Hmm.
an escapist trap for people. And one of the things that I think a lot about is what are sort of the cultural antidotes to that sort of trap or slippery slope. And it's something that I'm trying to sort of flesh out so it can be like a lighthouse for future
Hmm.
generations because we're just at the very beginning of this, and it has a lot of excitement and a lot of exploration to be done. But I also wonder, what are the things that are going to like keep people strong in terms of like not falling into a dependency or an addiction, because there's so many addictions with video games in general. Or another analog would be, in the psychedelic culture, there's a lot of people who end up having abusive relationships with various medicines. But I'm wondering if you've had
Hmm.
any like insight from any of the other cultures or scenes in general, that you think might have a positive impact on how people end up integrating VR.
Mm. Well, I think that addiction tends to stem from dissatisfaction with one's life circumstance. So when people kind of have externally, when they live in unpleasant environments, mentally and physically, they tend towards escapist addictions, and that's something I've experienced somewhat at various times of my life. And so I think whatever people can do to be encouraged towards feeling empowered to be able to generate and create a life that they love living. When you live a life that you love living, you're not prone to addiction. Ultimately, when people are happy, they don't get addicted to harmful things. So having conscious creators, meditators, magicians, people, psychonauts, people who have explored and have had access to higher levels of consciousness, having these types of people behind the creation of experiences in VR who know how to utilize symbols and know how potent it can be, I think is really, really important. Because I'll give you an example and a story. So I have a friend who's a tattoo artist. He's now he's an ex-tattoo artist. He now full-time is like an ayahuasca shaman who spent a lot of years in the jungle working with, I think, mostly the Hunikuan tribe, but he spent a lot of time with indigenous peoples training and apprenticing and learning ayahuasca shamanism after a 15 plus year of tattooing. But he kind of started out his career as a tattoo artist as a kind of like street kid and had run-ins with crime and stuff like that. But he said that he started tattooing and he was working all the time with these Tibetan symbols and things like that. And he thinks that just by tattooing these symbols and by focusing on the symbols all the time, that it had this transformative impact on his consciousness, that subconsciously these symbols were impregnating his consciousness because he was spending these long hours tattooing them and focusing so much attention onto them, that it changed his life just by focusing on the symbols. And his story is not the only one that I have encountered within the tattoo community of people kind of having similar journeys from having these encounters with symbols. So I think in the same way, there could be Trojan horses within virtual reality experiences where people come into contact with symbols that alter and affect their consciousness in ways that they're not actually even aware of happening. And I guess there are questions of ethics in that, but that's probably what happened to me through being in contact with music and art. And I think Tool's music kind of had a large impact on my consciousness and everything that they're doing. And I think I'm better for it. So I think that it's a good thing to be subconsciously orienting people towards higher states of consciousness through the utilization of symbols, even if they're not aware of it. And I think that if we had enough people who were conscious of these kinds of things and could create experiences that were enticing enough for the average consumer to use and could utilize these symbols to affect people's consciousness, that would be a very good thing.
Yeah, it's exciting to hear you articulate that because there is a lot of power in symbols. And sometimes I wonder if it has to do with some kind of form constant that's in neurological structure. Just sort of like the same way that music has a language to it, that even if you're not musically trained, that it'll impact you emotionally in a very consistent way. There was a really cool study, I want to say maybe last year or the year before, from UC Berkeley, and they had started to map out the emotional relationship to music in brain scans. And I feel like there's a similar phenomenon that happens with symbols across all the different cultures. And granted, there will definitely be some culturally contextual elements to it. I think that there's a reason why we see so many reoccurring archetypes from all over the world. And it'll be interesting to see how people become more fluent in that, whether it's because of their, sort of like educated understanding of it from their own practices, whether it's like artistic or art history or psychology, but also the way people who might not be educated in that stuff are exposed to it, then sort of like become aware over time, and sort of like realize that there's an underlying structure to that. So that's exciting. I'm glad to hear you say that because it reminds me of, even people like, Android working on microdose to think of the hidden Trojan horses that might be in there, and how that's affecting people. Um, Last year I got to try Chromadose, which is their therapeutic application for it. It's a slightly different structure, but they were integrating it with psychedelic therapy as well, which was amazing and kind of intense. Pardon me. Um, they were pairing it with ketamine in Oakland because they had recently decriminalized it and made it available for therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were working with some folks who could legally do that kind of therapy, which was really exciting because it was right at the beginning of that legal evolution with the substance. But they were pairing ketamine and chromadose and doing beta test sessions with folks. And at the time, there was a lot of Tonka art in chromadose. And it was really beautiful because they also had this biofeedback loop where
These ones behind you.
yeah, that we were looking at earlier. It was amazing because they also had integrated the heart monitor from the Muse. And so they would strap a Muse on your arm and you would wear a sub pack. And then you would go through chromadose. And granted, I personally didn't have ketamine with it. I think at the time, I was one of the few people who spent the most time in there during that week. I was in there for almost an hour. And the sub pack is mirroring your heartbeat. And so you have this immediate biofeedback for your cardiovascular system. And you would just sort of travel through this like tunnel of beautiful tonkas that would sort of evolve and change based on your biometrics. And gosh, it was amazing. And just to think that that's like a first iteration of something like that, and to see where it's going to be going just in the next few years. Because gosh, they worked so long on that. I remember hearing that he was working on microdose probably around the same time you had tried it, probably around like 2014, something like that.
He was literally working on it at Boom Festival like the entire time. I don't think Android probably barely went out to party at all. He was just in his studio working on microdose the whole time, like in this little office that
I don't blame him.
behind the gallery.
Yeah, when you have an idea like that, it's really inspiring and you just want to be in that flow state all the time about it. It's beautiful. I'm curious because we're both interested at this juncture in the potential of community building. And I've been thinking a lot about the various modern communities that developed around having shared magical practice and ritual. And I'm interested in immersive art. Immersive art is the foundation of why I'm interested in this medium, but it comes from my previous lifetime, in the festival scene, making performance art and doing interactive theater at events and sort of drawing people into like a mythical state of mind where they get to sort of explore new parts of who they want to choose to be. So they can sort of have that non-ordinary consciousness within a safe container of the immersive art. And they can kind of like tap into new neural relationships with who they want to choose to be or write themselves to be as like their mythical self. And so I'm curious, um, in the archetype of kind of like a world bridging modality, um, I want to sort of see where magical communities can be modular and sort of transcend space and time, like where they are on the planet, but then also sort of be able to like pop out of the ether and then organize in the real world.
Right.
As like a cute thought experiment, because to be quite honest, I don't have a lot of historical know-how on some of the recent groups, but you did a cool story on your Instagram recently where you went into some of the detail about, is it like Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV and that sort of thing? So
Yeah, the Temple of Psychic Youth, which
yeah.
your friend Jason Liv was a big part of, I believe.
I am super ignorant on that whole chapter of history, and you did a really great job going into it in your Instagram story.
Yeah,
Do you see any potential in being able to create spaces like that in VR?
sure,
Or like
totally.
build
I mean,
communities?
for me, it's a big thing because I live out in Bali where there's a couple really awesome people that have sort of similar interests, but not a lot of people, and there's certainly not a lot of accessibility when it comes to a kind of full-fledged temple or physical order or some kind of community to be able to explore magical experiences and experiments with. So this is something that I have a longing for, and I do work with like the AA, which is a magical order remotely, and had a conversation yesterday with the IoT and might participate with them as well. But it's very different doing solitary practice versus doing group dynamic ritual and stuff like that. And I do think that VR is an exciting way for people to be able to experience that and explore that because yeah, I'm not alone in these circumstances. I think the whole world is facing them because of the pandemic
Mhm.
and all the social distancing and everything, where these abilities to come together and to congregate as a community become less and less accessible. I know that there is somebody that developed a Golden Dawn temple space within VR that I've not yet had the chance to experience, but I think you can actually partake in the neophyte ritual of the Golden Dawn in VR,
Wow.
which is pretty cool.
Very.
You
Yeah.
know, and so that's one of those things like having a access to like a Golden Dawn temple.
Mhm.
It's kind of an elaborate setup that require you can't just put it in your house, you know.
Mhm.
You can do it astrally, you can do it in your mind, but having a physical container for it requires like a dedicated temple setup that very few people have access to. But you
Mhm.
can theoretically create some kind of analog to these types of ritual environments within VR that if somebody lived in an apartment and they didn't have access to a temple that they could go to, could still have a powerful experience that theoretically could still be very impactful on their consciousness.
Mhm.
So I mean, even what you're talking about with world creation, I think that there's a huge potential to explore virtual reality as hypersigil
Mhm.
because you can create a world. You know, you can create like a voodoo doll of a other reality that
Mhm.
then you can affect. And I don't think there's been any serious magicians who have actually explored to see if that could, to a certain degree, if experienced by enough people and done with the right intention, could actually have an impact on the world. You know, what would happen if you started to create a city that exists in the default world and affecting it somehow in VR and seeing if perhaps those effects would take hold in reality? You know, those are the types of irrational experiments that fascinate me as a magician.
It's the Buddha of the
The
future.
Buddha of the future.
I love it. Yeah, he's futuristic. I
Gorgeous.
heard a cute story the other day that, I mean, I have no idea how true it is or not, but I mean, that's just the nature of myths and legends and spiritual stories. But I had heard a story of the Buddha meditating under the tree, and this cute little snail comes by and sees him and sees the position of the sun and realizes that shortly the sun is going to be coming down past the shade of the tree. And so the sun would be directly on the Buddha's forehead. And the little snail thought to itself, oh, the sun will give him heat stroke and disturb his meditation. So I'm going to go ahead and help him out. And the little snail crawls up the Buddha and crawls up to his forehead and rests up there to block the sun. And a bunch of other little snails also come up and they form that little curly crown like you see over here. You know, it's just little snails These are all symbolic of the little snails that sacrificed themselves to help the Buddha maintain the like equilibrium of his meditation environment. I thought that was really
Oh,
cute.
that's cute. Super cute. Yeah.
I told that to my
Yeah,
Papa
this
Bear.
Bodhisattva's.
Let me tell you real quick. Don't worry.
Oh, go
I'm
for it.
gonna cut this out.
Yeah.
It's so dumb. I told my Papa Bear that story earlier today. I take care of him up in Oregon, and he goes, "That sounds like a UCSC story," because of their mascot is the banana slug, and I just thought it was
Oh,
super
right.
cute. That's
Yeah.
his way of saying like that sounds like some hippie shit,
Yeah, for sure.
right?
Yeah, this Bodhisattva is very built, you know? It's like this guy's definitely not just sitting around meditating all day. He's like pumping weights,
Yeah,
for sure.
chop wood, carry water. Surprisingly, I feel like a lot of us in modern society try to run away from discipline, and we try to run away from
Mm-hmm.
having to do things that seem repetitive or monotonous. But then a lot of times, like as we come around in maturity or just like our different phases of life, we realize that that's the place where you unlock a lot of your personal power that you had sort of like been denying
Absolutely.
yourself access to previously. So when I see like yoked Buddha over here, it just reminds me that that's a way of it's like a, I don't know, a literal metaphor. Is there such a thing?
Yeah.
I guess on some level there is. But yeah, the difference between like symbol and reality, and that's a big part of what I witness about virtual reality is like even in this museum, there's a little Roomba that's wandering around, like cleaning and polishing the
Oh, yeah, I've
imaginary
seen that.
floor, right? And so I wonder what effect that has on a like artistic symbolic level where, you know, we recreate these things from the real world that have purpose and represent something, but it's not relevant here. But as like a mental bullet point, it still holds space in the imagination for some reason. Oh, we get the view of all the butts. Check.
Yeah,
I got all the
the
butts.
butt view, yeah.
Yeah,
Someone's butt. That's a good one.
they got good bums. Yeah, I love this place as sort of a bridge between the past and the future. I think it's really special. It's so cute. I'm so wildly ignorant about certain fields of magic. I've just been like a wild magic witch. But
You
it's
know
really
what? I
cool
think like
tapping
that's
into. But I'm also like an
I think that's
academic
great.
nerd, you know? I love
Yeah,
academia.
right.
And so it's been really cool sort of like coming full circle. When I was little, right? Like I got into witchcraft at around 12. I picked up this book, Buckland's Book of
Mm-hmm.
Witchcraft. And it's like just
Oh,
this,
yeah.
right? It's like just old school English dude magic. And that was my first exposure to just like the general principles of it and sigil magic and stuff like that. And me and my bestie would goof around in that book. And we also had a shared dreaming practice. We would both do
Mm.
a kind of like visual meditation before bed, and then we would go join each other in dreams. And we would also do this thing where we created these rituals where we would swim down to the bottom of her swimming pool and like meditate at the bottom of the swimming pool in the shade of the fig tree. And it like had to be in the
Mm.
shade of the fig tree because it was like you disappeared, like you couldn't see the person anymore from the surface. Pardon me, there was
Mm.
like a motorcycle
Wow.
just went by. And even though a lot of that is just on the surface seems like silly childhood stuff, it really had an amazing impact on like the formation of my magical practice, but also just my imagination in general. And even to this
Sure.
day, her and I will share dreams like with a
Mm-hmm.
lot with more frequency than is able to be accounted for otherwise. And like she'll call me up and be like, "Oh, I had this dream and you were in it and it was this place and this vibe and this stuff was going on." And I'll be like, "Are you serious?" Like, cuz I had a dream with this place and this vibe and this thing going on. And there's way more overlap than, like I said, you can account for. Um
Sure.
so going from being like a wild magical art witch to letting my love of academia from other disciplines like bleed over has been really fun because it feels full circle. especially with like mythology lately. Having grown up doing it's like what got me into the visionary thing to begin with was mythology and was seeing the overlap
Hmm.
between the major archetypes in comparative religious studies, with the world
Yeah.
tree and with the serpent and things like that. So to be able to sort of like come full circle in that way has been really refreshing. It's like I get to re-experience all my favorite things on a deeper level and experience it through other people's journeys too. That's why I was like, curious about your personal history with that sort of thing and been like picking other friends' brains and just kind of like getting to witness the collective consciousness in that way.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of parallels between art and magic where I studied art like at a classical art school and met amazing technical artists that weren't really creating anything. They could
Hmm.
paint like masters, but they could only work within the confines of the system that they were trained in. And to me, that's not a success. And there are people that pursue magic in the same way, where you can get somebody that has done the entire Golden Dawn or AA system and is incredibly has knows every nuance of that system, but isn't really effective at being able to do their own magic. And I think that these should be more like just training wheels for you to be able to develop and build out your own working and effective magical methods. And
Hmm.
that's kind of where my interests more so lie, even though I also love learning from the tradition and
Hmm.
stuff. And I've been following the AA system. It's very rigorous and it's very advanced and it's very intellectually intense and requires an insane amount of reading and study and stuff. It's like being in graduate school, but as a magician. And I love it because for me, that's fun for me. I also love to nerd out on all of the arcane texts and to read and decipher and try to understand what they're talking about. But I had a session with this psychic guy last week. It's like um, my my partner was working for this extremely overpaid, in my opinion, a tantra teacher. This guy that studied all these arcane occult techniques in India and now works with private clients who are like crypto millionaires for huge sums of money to teach them basically like Indian occultism.
Hmm.
And he works with this psychic guy, is like his own private psychic. And he wanted to get some. He wanted some NFT things. He needed like a foundation invite, and so I traded him the foundation invite for some like sessions with this psychic, who's like I think he's normally like $5,000 a session or something like that. But the psychic basically was like, oh, like you can just like do magic naturally. He's like, you're like me, And I was like, yeah. And I was like, but I've been doing this like AA system thing. Do you think that's like a good method? Should I pursue that? Should I keep training with that? And he's like, well, you can already do it. Like, why do you need to do that? Like, because you already have that ability. And I was like, yeah, but it's like fun for me though.
Hmm.
Like I like the study and I like the learning, and it inspires me and it gives me new creativity and gives me different ideas. Like I don't necessarily think that the way like Crowley did magic is just like the be all end all and everybody should try to emulate him exactly. But I'm still really interested in how kind of ornate his ideas of magic were, and I take inspiration from that. And sometimes I read things and how he did something that kind of like opens a new door to understanding a different way that I could approach something.
Hmm.
And it's like that with that's why I read books from like many different traditions and explore all different perspectives on it, because like every single magician has a different way of doing things.
Hmm.
And that's interesting for me to basically, just the same way that I like going to art galleries and seeing other artists work. I'm not necessarily going to emulate it completely, but I might take inspiration from something that they realized or had an insight about that I personally didn't before seeing it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's exciting. I like all these overlaps, especially just being able to sort of sometimes understand your own internal process better by seeing how other people have structured their own systems. It kind of reminds me of traditional cooking, how so many people will want to go to a book. And there's nothing wrong with that because somebody did the experimentation and figured it out and refined it into something that is really straightforward and works if you do it, if you follow the instructions. But at the same time, I'm kind of just like a silly MacGyver. And so I'll look at the physics of it, and that's kind of what taught me how to cook. I grew up with like a great cook in the house. And so just watching them and seeing how processes unfold has been the thing that informed technique rather than reading from a book. But at the same time, it's interesting to go back and look at documentation and look at how people have explained their process, but also their technique as a way of seeing how those universal themes in how to direct the energy or visualize it or even just integrate it. So I know a lot of people will talk about not doing magic too often, and it was something you mentioned earlier. And one of the things that I also mentioned earlier is like my caution towards it. So for me on a personal level, um, I tend to do tiny magic all the time. And it always tends to be very collaborative. And it always tends to be stuff that I only really put my will towards things that are in collaboration with the universe and other harmonic energies. But at the same time, like I try to like live in a perpetually magical space in that way. And one of the reasons why I'm very sparing about larger magic is only because I want to be capable of holding the result. And sometimes I have like big aspirations or a long form perspective that I'm trying to get to at some point. And there have been moments where like I've really tapped in and brought a bunch of energy towards that end and not really had, britches big enough to hold some of the results that came flooding in. And it wasn't that any of the results were bad. They were all totally things that I wanted very much in my life. But I was like, shit, I don't have the structure to hold all of it at this point, And so that's one of the reasons why I tend to be cautious about it. But in having pursued creating like an environment that's constantly circulating like small level like magical occurrences or just, holding the energy all the time, it's definitely allowed that garden to hold bigger and bigger things at a faster turnover rate. To the point where, like, when I look at where I am now, there's no way I could have imagined I would actually get there with the aspirations that I had before. It's very much the exact same vision I had hoped for and wanted, but because it was so ambitious back in the day, sometimes it just blows my mind when I turn around and I like sort of time travel and I feel like tiny Sarah, little, small sprout Sarah, and the things that she wanted for her life. And then through that practice and just constantly, tending the garden of those visualizations, and then to be able to turn around and be like, wow, wildest dreams. I couldn't even imagine that I'd get to this point or that there was even a trajectory to get there. So I think that as people become more fluent in being able to enact their will, they'll start to understand the structures that allow that to unfold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic, and congratulations.
Yay.
I think that we're all like, we're all doing this is the so I understand what you're saying. I think like a certain degree of caution is healthy with exploring occult methods, much like a certain degree of caution is healthy with the exploring psychedelics. And these are all kind of like dangerous things in a certain sense, but they also, just like driving a car is dangerous.
Yeah.
When you learn how to drive a
Yeah.
car, and
It can be
not as dangerous
overwhelming.
anymore. Yeah, and there's like different reasons to do magic. People tend to focus a bit on enchantment or manifestation work, but there are higher aims for magic as well. What like apotheosis, um,
Yeah.
theurgy, the idea that there are higher aspects of our consciousness that we can will into being through ritual work. I think that that's kind of like actually, interestingly enough, contrary to popular opinion, that's generally what Crowley's magic is focused on, not manifestation work. And Damien Eccles, he's a prominent contemporary magic teacher, talks about like the 90-10 rule. It's like 90% of your magic should be towards what he calls spiritual sustenance. And that could be like doing invocation work, things that like call in higher forms of consciousness. Meditation is of that vein, and then 10% of it is for personal manifestation. And you probably can't go too wrong with that. I think different periods of time, different points of your life kind of require different uses for it. And I just think it's something that we're doing all the time. Everybody is. And it's the generative, creative potential that all human beings have and possess. It's not something supernatural. It's actually incredibly innate to our humanness. And people are manifesting all the time. They are
Mm-hmm.
using magic all the time, but most people are just not trained in it or not conscious of it. And so they don't get good results. So actively engaging in some form of intentionality in directing your will to manifest in a certain way is actually just a way of harm reduction, if you want
Mm-hmm.
to think about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good skill, and I think that everybody to a certain degree should be trained in it. And what you're talking about also is kind of the most important aspect, which is that there is the true will or the universal, the Tao, if you want to call it that. It's the sort of what is most natural and in harmony with the highest unfolding of the grand tapestry of the universe and the role that we play in that. And the most important aspect of magic or spiritual discovery training is to encounter that and to clarify what that is and to get in right relationship to it. And from that place, you can't go wrong with doing magic. It's magic only goes wrong when you're out of alignment with your true will and when you're out of alignment with the natural unfolding and the sort of the balance of the universe.
It's so true. And I think that when people get the best results, it is because they're in alignment with that. I think it's really interesting that you brought out apotheosis, as it's something that a lot of traditional religious perspectives see as profane. Whereas I think that the magical perspective is that that's the sacred work, is being able to draw down one's higher self. And that's definitely an archetype that also expresses itself a lot in the psychedelic community and the sort of like new age
Mm-hmm.
spiritual community. But yeah, being able to tap into that higher order, like harmonic self on the daily is sort of like the power engine to be able to um, have magical results all the time. And that's the thing that like
Yeah.
I've learned out in the thickets as just like a wild, like less academic magician. Um, but in that
Mm-hmm.
way, I feel like it's been a much more direct experience. And as much as I love like nerding out and reading stuff, um, I tend to just look at it more from a technical standpoint, and I don't necessarily integrate all the practices that I do research on. But being able to see that contrast and perspective of apotheosis has been especially useful to me in the past few years, um, especially regarding dream work, as I feel as though
Mm-hmm.
on a certain level, when you start lucid dreaming, because you're put in the position of also being the co-writer of the dream in real time, that it really asks you to rely on those training wheels, and also just the sense of like self-compassion, not to fall into like older hurt programs that can sort of
Hmm.
be hang-ups in dream work psychologically. Yeah.
Yeah,
Man.
DreamWorks are actually quite a good mechanism for training one's lucid capacities just in life in general.
Mhm.
And I think it's such a blasphemy that apotheosis would be considered profane. And I would really question the motivations of anybody that would say that, because that's really what the great work is to realize our divine nature.
Mhm.
And that's what all the great spiritual teachers, whether it's, Jesus Christ or the Buddha, were trying to get people to wake up to.
Mhm.
And to see our inherent generative creative capacity to be architects of the dream that we co-create.
Mhm.
It's important because people unconsciously influence that and make it something less beautiful than it could be if every person was awake and using that generative capacity consciously.
Mhm.
If the whole world was awakened to their generative magical capabilities, and we were consciously co-creating the world together, it could be phenomenally beautiful. But people are kind of stuck in these nightmares that they can't wake up from. And I feel like now is kind of an urgent time to wake people up from that and to help people realize that.
I heard this little girl the other day say, and her father had taught her a lot of just like really beautiful heart wisdom. You could tell she was so small, but one of the things that she said is that we pray for hurt people. And so much of the things that hold people back in those nightmares and keep them asleep are their traumas. And the things that fuel
Oh
addiction
yeah.
are their traumas. And one of the things that I think is interesting about like a magical perspective and an apotheosis perspective is to just like live one's prayer rather than just beseech some kind of divinity outside oneself, or to look for a savior outside of oneself. To, not just this idea like, oh, we pray for hurt people, but sort of like, and you can't heal people, but you can create environments that aid them being empowered and understanding that the healing that they're looking for is a mechanism that they have within themselves all the time, and that it's
Hmm.
really just like a shift within themselves to have the compassion to look at the energetic structure of their trauma and how to move outside of being stuck within it, you know, and at least start to be compassionate for themselves. Because people are often like so hurt by their trauma that they sort of integrate that they deserved it, or that they aren't worthy, or that they they're
Yeah.
damaged by it beyond repair, but when people find
Hmm.
their strength in having survived it, or that they're sort of like forged by their experience, I think that that in and of itself is also a kind of magic. Especially right now, people have been going through so much pain and change and unexpected circumstances that a lot of people feel really defeated, and they don't know how they're going to cope with it or grow into this weird future, or this weird timeline that we've been given. And so I feel like
Hmm. Yeah.
if there was ever any a point in history where people really needed magic, and they really needed to just like understand that they are magic, and that it's like you're saying, everybody is imbued with this ability and capacity. They just might not know the name of it. They might not know how it works. They might not have been given any kind of support to be able to trust themselves. Everybody's really just like gaslit by society right now. And I think
Yeah.
that in a way, what we do kind of encourages people to trust themselves enough to like um, sort of like turn in and trust their own authority and trust their intuition, and to know that they don't have to seek validation from outside, and that
Mm-hmm.
their art matters. It doesn't matter how crude it is. It doesn't matter if they haven't been schooled or learned any fancy techniques. Just the fact that it's such an innate human capacity to create really is like the crown gift of us as a species. And even other animals are creative, but just
Mm-hmm.
the way that we are like sapient and can reflect on our experience through that. I think art is like
Mm.
when I'm a dork and I'm thinking about why I was incarnated the way I am this time around. One of the defining factors of it is that humans make art, and um, I needed to make art this time around. And it's not something that I solely do for myself. I do it because I want it to be infectious for other people. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
see other people really like imbuing those same values and like love in their work, and they're just really set free by what they do, yeah, I really just want to like share that infectiousness and that self-actualization, because that, like we're saying, like that is the true core of the work, is to be free to self-actualize. It's
Yeah.
so
I
it's
mean,
so
you and I
cool.
probably both.
Go for
I
it.
mean, we've both probably. I mean, I certainly have been in very dark places in my life and have certainly been felt very disempowered and contemplated suicide, and like I know what it feels like to feel just subject to forces beyond my control that are asserting a kind of like nightmarish existence upon me. And I was able to figure out how to overcome that, and I know that a lot of people are in that same boat. And it's almost like, I'm not like, I don't necessarily believe in like Satan or something like that, but there are sort of like archetypal dark forces, and like what's more insidious than a culture that is dominated by making people believe that like life and is meaningless and just inert material nothing. That's so like counter to just the human spirit, and it doesn't aid people. It doesn't. So like I'm inspired to help re-enchant. Like I believe in the re-enchantment of the world. I believe in people discovering that they're not just a bunch of matter, but they're actually part of this inexpressible tapestry of energy and life force. If you want to call it God or whatever that word is that works for people. And that by understanding that and by honing that, they can essentially create anything they want within their lives. And that, we live in a reality with no real limitations beyond the ones that we impose upon ourselves.
I think it's so funny that with a scientific perspective of the world, that it's been attempted to be packaged in a way that derives it of spirit. But for me, I've always felt like the sciences really just like highlight and showcase how incredible and enchanted the universe is.
Sure,
Just
yeah, I
the
agree. And
yeah.
ideally, that is the perspective that scientists would hold, because when you really look at things, even scientifically, like the way DNA works, and even the kind of terminology that scientists use to describe the workings of DNA and mitochondria and all this stuff, and it's like, wait, what? And they don't
Hmm.
trip out about it. Like there's these tiny robots that like build this like code made of living language that engineers our
Right.
entire like it's like, what? That is pretty far out. That's like something something you'd read in some arcane magic book.
Yeah.
That's science.
So on a totally silly personal note, I've been into sigil magic for a long time, and chaos magic, really got reinterested in runes lately. And I also avoided tarot for a really long time. And over the past 6 months or so, me and my girlfriend really just went down the tarot card hole, which is super cute. We'll like do readings for each other and just, understand the archetypes of it. Oh God, I think I have like 6 decks now. It's ridiculous. It's borderlining a problem.
Have too many. You can never have too many tarot decks.
Don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. I have too many. It's cute because like the really heavy ones I got for myself, and then a lot of the oracle decks I have were gifted to me by friends, and I really like the balance of that energetically. And some of them are like heavy duty hermetic alchemy ones, like the Order of the Golden Dawn deck, and then I have I just got like a Jungian archetype deck, which is super elegant and simple, and I like it in terms of being able to access it on a level that doesn't have a lot of window dressings, and then also being able to go to the other deck that just like goes down astrological rabbit holes of just like different associations and stuff. So I went down the tarot rabbit hole, and that has been really amazing because for me, like, it almost feels like this psychoanalytic and like quantum relationship with, matter, and just like shuffling the deck or seeing where it splits or seeing where the attention goes, and then how it's like a mirror for the psyche. And I tend to just have the conversation with it about what energies are going to be beneficial for me to keep in mind going through different circumstances in life. That tends to be how I relate to it. I don't really use it for what other people might call divination. Like, I don't ask it what do I do about my business meeting next week, but I ask it like, what should I keep at the forefront of my consciousness, energetic, going through different like little phases or portals. But then it was interesting because I was inspired to pick up runes, and I'm a language nerd. I love language and symbol and semantics, and just like the history of words and syllables and things. And so going to a really fundamental symbolic linguistics set and learning the runes was really cool because it didn't hit on a intellectual circuit. It hit more on like an emotional circuit, the way narrative or storytelling or cinema hits me, or music, rather than like an intellectual place. And I've been memorizing them over the past couple weeks, and it's so cool because they manifest themselves in my mind kind of like friends, or kind of like pieces of a broader human story that I didn't expect it to. So that's been really cool. And then, God, I told you about that silly thing I did the other night where I decided to painted a bunch of runes on myself with UV glow paint, and I turned on my black light. I've been obsessed with black light and glow paint for the past couple of years. I'm trying to take it from a lowbrow place to a higher brow place. Be sort of, the shit glows. It's totally magical. It's Indiana Jones moment when he's in a dark temple and he holds up a light and these runes and these, carvings glow, right? And so that's kind of the aesthetic that I love about glow stuff. It has this hidden radiance in it that you activate with light. And I think that's incredible. For me, that lights up my spirit when I get to see that process. And it's physics driven, but for me, it's super enchanted. And so I was explaining to my homie and technology officer, he practices magic and doesn't know it. Kind of like, we're talking about people who are going through this, they're doing the work, and they're burnishing the spirit and polishing their psyche, understanding processes within themselves, really pulling up into their higher self. But he doesn't have any understanding about technique or lexicon or history or whatever regarding magic, but he knows that it's something that is a fairly big part of my life. Well, understatement. But it was so cute because I started explaining it to him, and we were high. We were high. We were playing Cyberpunk 2077 while high, and then I just started going off on this magical riff. I'm like, blah blah blah. Would give me this look. We're having this conversation right now, and I'm like, yeah. And he's like, oh wow, like I knew it was a big part of your life, but I'm excited that you're like explaining it because I was curious, but wasn't really motivated to ask for some reason. And I was pretty much inferring upon him. I was like, you do it all the time, but like here's the underlying mechanisms that happen. And it was super cute watching his face like melt. He was like, whoa. And then I just had this silly, I learn best witnessing things and seeing things, right? And so I was like, I'm just gonna throw down and do magic right now. And so I painted a bunch of runes on myself. I had just made this like gorgeous rune chart for myself for my birthday. And I have a pole in my office. I have a dance pole. And I was just like, the pole is now Axis Mundi. It's Yggdrasil. And I'm covered in runes. And I'm going to do this giant line of K. And then I'm going to like dance. And I'm going to go out of my body and see what happens. I had never been that high on K. It was so funny.
That seems like good magical technology to me.
It was dope. And I showed you the doodle he had done of my face. That was what I turned into. It was so good.
Your future tattoo.
Yes, my future tattoo. I told him about that too. And he's like, we should get little buddy tattoos. So cute. But it was fun showing on a bare bones level that like you can just create your own rituals. And granted, all of that was really super hashed out by a lot of previous experience of mine as, as a performance artist and doing like ritual dance and flow arts and makeup arts and stuff like that. But I hadn't really crunched it down to base components before. It was almost like before it was really planned out and ornate filigree and lots of nuance, tiny details and stuff. And in this instance, I just took it down to its most base components to be able to show it as a process. And it was so funny because that's exactly what happened to my experience was the components of conscious experience in this place were super crunched down to total base pair. And it was super scary but beautiful at the same time. Just the level of self-love it took not to fucking stress out with how abstracted shit got. Like you were describing, like popping in and out of black holes and stuff. It was like hanging out at it was very much being spaghettified. It was dope, even though it was terrifying. It was very initiatory. When I came out, I told my friend, I was like, oh my God, I'm completely wrecked. And it was like I had turned into the page, like having drawn all those runes on myself, I became the page. And I realized in a way that we are the letter. We are the rune. We like, not that we're symbolic, not real or whatever, but, and it kind of relates a little bit to simulation theory. But I realized that like we are the incantations of larger spiritual beings or structures or whatever, like if we're like the children of gods, like we are their runes, and they cast us in matter, in this matrix, like even going into language, matrix being Latin, being related to matter and maternal, and so it's like mother and relates to womb. And so it's like the matrix is like the womb of matter. But yeah, getting all nerdy.
Well, yeah.
I'm interested to bring all of these ideas into VR with like motion capture and creating ritual spaces and creating spaces that have overlap between the virtual world and then the real world with whether it's AR or like hologram projection stuff, projection mapping in general. And be able to, like we were talking about before, see the relationship between energetic structures in the virtual as hypersigil and like then see how it manifests in energy systems in the real world.
Yeah, if if you look at kind of like the historical account of magic thus far, it's like you have like grimoire tradition, hermetic magic, alchemy, Golden Dawn, Thelema, Wicca, chaos magic. Like that's like really simplified, but you got like something like that, right? And like chaos magic still has been kind of like the magical chapter that still is sort of in a way at large. We're like in some and related to it now. But if you ask me what the next big magical movement is, it's technomancy. It's
Yes.
the integration of technology, artificial intelligence, and psychedelics, which are a technology, and consciousness methods, right? And this is like we're just barely exploring that, but I think that that's kind of like the next big movement for magical technology that we're going to see in the next, few years.
Mm-hmm. That's a really exciting note to wrap up on for sure. And I'm really interested to see like where the culture goes in the next couple years, especially because there are quite a few players within the scene who are aware of the potentials and the implications with it as a technology that can be used in that way. And that it doesn't just have to be like a passive consumer medium, that it can really have an impact on how people like structure their thoughts and then live their lives in the real world too.
And I think like Tim Leary and John Lilly and all these guys were like pioneers of that, and Terrence too. I mean, Terrence
Mm-hmm.
McKenna was really into virtual reality, and it's obviously a technology that can have a huge impact on our consciousness and can be wielded for good or for evil, and needs to be hopefully wielded with the right minds to push it more towards the good side.
Well, thank you for spending some time with me here in this awesome museum. Just like, chatting it up, sharing thoughts about all these deep overlapping topics.
So much fun. It was such a
Yeah,
great way to start off my Sunday.
right?
Thanks so much for inviting me to do this.